We have.
Just a point of clarification or a question. I thought the latest thinking on what happened to the Neanderthals were that they were wiped out by the Homo sapiens, like in a kind of a first genocide, somebody mentioned.
So what happens is that the Neanderthals get increasingly wiped out, and they do get killed by Homo sapiens, but the way that that plays out is that they retreat into increasingly small populations and tiny little pockets of Neanderthal civilization in places like Guernsey, for example, where the isolation of these communities means that they can no longer sustain the depth of the division of labor to which they'd previously on which they'd previously been so reliant for their social structure. So the claim that suddenly you hit a point with Neanderthals where they're not inventing new tools because they've reached the limit of their brain capacity. Well, that was the old way of looking at it. The new way of looking at it was that they were no longer able to take the time to learn the tools properly because they were increasingly being pushed out to fight and go hunting. The educational system collapsed. You no longer had the kinds of specialists required to invent new tools, and this led to a basic freezing of the level of technology that they had, while the societies eventually succumbed to extinction.
Yeah, I guess it's just a comment, and maybe a question will be in there as well. I guess it's the tone of your address, of your manifesto-like style, in relation to invoking the spectre of climate change, which is obviously very real, and using the Neanderthals as an example in terms of them dying out because of the transmission of skills not being passed on across generations, and how I wonder if we can actually put these conversations in dialogue with Bernard's work around innovation to reflect on, like, a lot of the so-called tools that we are embedded in and composed by and individuated by are completely useless in the sense that they offer us nothing, really. They offer us something, but we don't need them. I don't believe that. I think that we can survive. I think. I do think that a lot of the information that is obviously stored on digital technologies now and on magnetic media, it will get lost. There is a spectre of extinction hanging over magnetic media forms. 10, 15 years is what's quoted. So I just wonder if we could reframe the debate really in terms of, like, not accelerating towards, we're not going to have all these tools, how are we going to cope in our environment, instead of thinking, actually redirecting it into saying, well, actually these tools are useless and don't serve us. So I guess it's more about a question of how to reframe the debate in terms of a less hysterical, getting people scared way about it, and sort of framing it in terms of the uselessness of consumer technologies, that nobody needs a talking fridge, that kind of thing.
Thanks, Gerald. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you envisaged digital studies and what you've elsewhere referred to the development of a third culture, or a network techne, in its relation to the sciences, and to what one might call scientism. I'll be talking a bit about this on Saturday. The belief that it's really science and scientific epistemology that can define all areas of the human for us. Because I was struck by your reference to Susan Greenfield, and it seems to me that she's quite a singular and lone voice in the British neuroscientific community, and people who think a bit like her often come up very much against the disciplinary prejudices of their colleagues. And it seems to me that within science generally, there are people like Colin Blakemore and others in the neuroscientific community who are very, very conservative about how they think about cerebral plasticity, for instance. So how something like digital studies or a third culture would respond to the sciences and scientism, which would clearly restrict it or even invalidate the kind of presuppositions of general organology.
So I'll start with your point first, Ian. And I think that we need to be very suspicious. So there is a basic pharmacology or a basic hospitality at work in current discourses of interdisciplinarity. To put it in Derridian terms, the real risk is that if we open ourselves up, and I say this as a humanities scholar, if we open ourselves up too much to the scientists, they take over the household. And we only need to look at something like evolutionary aesthetics, which for the most part is total crap as an academic discipline. You know, it's perpetuating that discourse where a beautiful painting is beautiful because it testifies to the genetic fitness of the person who painted it, rather than tells us anything about the painting in itself. I do think that we need to be really very suspicious about that kind of third culture. But I'd say, moreover, that it's not third culture. It's simply a variation on this theme of adaptation, where what we're saying is that the humanities have to adjust to a meta-narrative of adaptation. We're now in the world of science and technology. They dictate the terms and we just go along with that. One of the things that I think is so absolutely vital about the potential of digital studies being understood as a discourse of artificial selection is that it becomes a way for the humanities to start talking about culture in a discourse that can be overlain onto natural selection, which doesn't invalidate it, but which shows how it can exist alongside it. And the reason that I think that that's so important is that, on one hand, we know that there is a very considerable weakness that comes with the overextension of the natural sciences when they start talking about areas of culture in a very biologizing manner. But equally, so many discourses about the salvation of the humanities are just woolly crap. All this vacuous guff about teaching, being critical and learning to appreciate things, it's all well and good, but it doesn't, I don't feel like it generates enough discursive momentum really to be taking the sciences on the kind of terrain that they're going to be able to make something of. And this is why I think that artificial selection becomes so important, because we can directly articulate the humanities in terms of the way, in Bernard's language, that it is about the refunctionalization of the human body through tools. And what we're looking at in the whole of the humanities, from history, literary criticism, and so on, is the history of the ways in which biological bodies have been reinvented through tools. So, for example, looking at phenomena like the crisis of novel reading that comes in the 19th century, or the way in which Johannes Vermeer uses optics to open up experiences of vision that haven't been neurologically possible prior to that. It strikes me that this is a way that we can engage fruitfully with the sciences, drawing on discourses like neuroscience, like evolutionary biology, but only insofar as they then give us the basis for talking about what it is that we do. Coming back to the other question with regard to hysteria, I think there's something to be said for hysteria when what is at stake is the climate. But I agree with you fully that a lot of the technologies that we currently have don't do anything. I'd actually go further and say not only do they don't do anything, they are actively disabusing us of our ability to use tools in an environment creating way. And the analogy that I drew at the end there between epiphylogenetic collapse of the kind that the Neanderthals suffered and consumer lock-in, where what we currently have is that we're simply passive recipients of a lot of tools that we have. We can't use them for individuation. We can't use them to transform our environments. We simply use them to act out sets of scenarios that have been embedded in them from the outset by the people who designed them for the purposes of consumption. So to that extent, I'd say that getting caught up in that situation where we simply become passive workers through of tools that have been designed with consumption in mind is very seriously debilitating. And it's only by rejecting that kind of pacified tool use that we'd get back to the ability to think more productively about the ways in which tools we really engage with tools for the process of future creation, for the process of self-inscription, and so on. And the analogy that I draw there, so James Lovelock will talk a lot about the problem of a lack of generalists. We are too dependent on a very high level of division of labour, and we see the way that this permeates academia. To extend your point, not only might we say that we don't need fridges that talk, we might also say that we don't need academics who write 90 identical articles on the same insignificant footnote. This is not an effective use of division of labour. That is simply the performance of a certain kind of consumerist role. And what we need to do is simply stop simply succumbing to the performance of that kind of role, the performance of the consumer, the performance of the academic, and get back to a more critical, substantial thinking of what it is that we actually do, what the tools that we are intending to build and use should be doing. And so I think in that sense that the kind of critical discourse that Balna is offering of individuation and of consumer lock-in is also the one that holds out the best potential for avoiding the kind of epiphylogenetic collapse of which Lovelock speaks.
There's also the problem of digital technologies being... There's also a problem of digital technologies being enormously... energy intensive, even in their, I'm in agreement with you broadly. I just want to say that. So I think this is the question of moving this project, somewhere, not necessarily forward. If we're going to be, drawing in the questions of climate change, et cetera, there's got to be an awareness of those things, of the ecological damage that digital technologies do to the environment.
Of course.
Your paper is a way of depicting not even a grand narrative, a huge narrative. And talking about narratives, we are still, it seems to me, immersed in the last one that began more or less in the 17th century. The slogan was "Dismiss the past, anticipate the future," and manifestos are part of this narrative. Probably the only difference now is we are not so sure about the future. But again, the point seems to me that there is a risk when you describe the battlefield for the future. A risk of forgetting probably and even renouncing the only space, Bergson, forgive me, in which we all are and in which we'll always will be, the present.
To some extent, but I'm still not entirely sure why that would necessarily be an issue. So what I mean by that is the way in which I initially heard your question, for example, and the way in which I think I very easily lay myself open to criticism. If I say that the vast majority of academia is a narcissism that just involves writing out meaningless articles that serve no purpose, that contribute nothing to the end of the world apart from feeling bad when we see people starving on TV, I can see that the easy claim that similar to the one that you make is that, well, that says that immediately just instrumentalizes, and it says that precisely the function of academia to use the present as a moment for reflection and suspension from instrumental concerns. I do recognize that that's a risk. However, as with everything, as Bernard would say, it has to be considered pharmacologically here. In other words, yes, of course there's a risk, but some risks are worth taking. It's not a question of abandoning everything. I'm not saying that everything has to be thrown into the future, although frankly it pretty much does with about 15 years that we have left, and I don't really see what the issue is with saying that. At the same time, I do think that academia needs to find a compromise between, we do need not just to reorientate ourselves around the digital revolution, i.e. re-articulating new forms of education to fit with our current predicament, because we all know that lectures don't work anymore. We all know that we write articles not for people to read, but for promotion purposes. That's the only function that they serve. That being the case, we need to change what we're doing to fit with our present predicament, but we also need to change what we're doing to fit with the only predicament that really matters anymore, and that is the preservation of the climate. That may well involve a certain sacrifice of the present. If in 15 years' time it proves that James Lovelock was talking rubbish, I'll hold my hands up and say, well, I was a bit naive, wasn't I? I don't think it'll happen.
Short?
Yes.
1 minute.
Yeah. First, I would like to remember that we talk about general organology, and this program of digital studies is a way for entering into this question of general organology. For me, digital studies and general organology are transdisciplinary axioms. We need to produce transdisciplinary axioms. And the question here is not only the question of humanities, it is also a question for computer scientists, physicists, and biologists, etc., etc. Because if we claim that digital studies is the actuality of what we call general organology, says that, for example, the change of the brain is a technical and a social question. The change of society is a question of computers, and computers are applied mathematics, etc. So it's also a question for mathematicians, etc. And here the question is to take and to keep two questions together. The first one, that is also to develop practical organology, is to produce new inventions, to produce a new concept or new paradigm of innovation. It is very classical to denounce innovation as an ideology, and it is an ideology of marketing, but we need another type of innovation. And it is now extremely possible to do that, because everybody knows that we need a new reason, a new reasonable discourse, etc., which is not a classical discourse on reason, a metaphysical one, but which is a discourse against rationalization. And everybody knows now that this rationalization is a main problem. Because the climate change, for example, made this obvious, and it is also the case for many questions, like in financial market, for example. When personally I discuss a lot with bankers, and they know that it's not possible to continue to work like that, but they don't have an alternative as a discourse. So it is our responsibility, academics, to work to produce this alternative with them, and not in our disciplines separately. It's not possible. We must work together. This is extremely difficult, but it is also now an opportunity, a possibility, because the situation is obliges us to do that.
Okay, thank you very much for all your comments, and for Gerald Moore once again for his paper.